David adjusted his tie as he walked through the city park, the crisp morning air providing a brief respite from the suffocating weight of his daily routines as a surgeon. He wasn't sure why he came here today. Maybe to clear his head, or maybe just to observe life in its simplest forms. He was seated on a bench, watching joggers, families, and dog walkers pass by, when a cheerful voice interrupted his thoughts. Lemonade. Only $1. A little girl with sparkling eyes and a confident smile was holding a tray of paper cups filled with lemonade. She looked about 6, her ponytail bobbing as she approached passers-by with a charm that seemed to disarm everyone. David's gaze froze when the girl turned toward him. Her face was eerily familiar. He stared, unable to look away. Her wide brown eyes, the slight upward tilt of her nose. It was like looking into a younger version of himself. His heart raced as the girl skipped over. "Hi, mister. Would you like to buy some lemonade? It's really good, and my mom made it." David swallowed hard and smiled, trying to mask his shock. "Sure, I'll take one," he managed to say, fishing $1 from his wallet. As the girl handed him the cup, he noticed a woman sitting on a picnic blanket nearby, watching the girl and a toddler boy playing with toys. The woman's head was bowed slightly, her face partially obscured by her hair as she attended to the little boy. But he recognized her instantly. Jessica Lane. David hadn't seen her in over 7 years. Their paths had crossed briefly during her residency when she was an ambitious, vibrant medical student. For reasons he hadn't fully understood then, their connection had been cut short when he was abruptly transferred to another hospital in another state. He had moved on, consumed by his career, leaving everything unresolved. Now, here she was. The sight of her with 2 children sent a swirl of emotions through him: confusion, anger, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of loss. He couldn't help but notice how content she seemed, laughing softly as her toddler boy tried to stack blocks. Was the little girl his? He clenched the cup of lemonade in his hand, unsure of his next move. Approaching her felt wrong. What if he was mistaken? What if the life she'd built didn't have room for him? But as he glanced back at the girl, now busy wiping a spill on her tray, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Before he could gather the courage to approach, the little girl darted back to the picnic blanket. "Mommy! Mommy, I sold another one," she exclaimed, earning a warm smile from Jessica. David watched from a distance, the lemonade untouched in his hand. His mind raced with questions. If she was his daughter, why hadn't Jessica told him? And who was the father of the boy? For now, he stayed rooted to the bench, watching a piece of a life that felt like it could have been his, wondering if it still might be. David's mind wouldn't rest after that encounter. The little girl's face haunted him, and the way Jessica had smiled at her children stirred emotions he couldn't ignore. Was Sophie his daughter? The timing of his transfer years ago lined up too perfectly to dismiss. But why hadn't Jessica told him if she was? Questions swirled in his mind as he sat in his dimly lit apartment that night, replaying the scene from the park over and over. By morning, David had made a decision. He hired a private investigator, a methodical, discreet man named Elliot, to uncover the truth. "I'll need as much information as you can provide," Elliot said during their meeting. David handed over what little he had: Jessica's name, her old hospital affiliation, and a vague timeline of their brief connection. He also mentioned the park encounter and the lemonade stand. "She's got 2 kids," David added, hesitating before continuing. "A little girl about 6 and a toddler boy." Elliot nodded. "That's enough to start. Give me a week." The week passed agonizingly slowly. David buried himself in work, using back-to-back surgeries to suppress his anxiety. But at night, his thoughts returned to Jessica and the children. When Elliot called, his voice was calm and professional, but his words sent David's heart racing. "I found her. Jessica Lane. She lives in the city, about 15 minutes from the park where you saw her. She works as a nurse at a nearby clinic. The girl's name is Sophie Lane, and the boy is Max Lane. Sophie Lane, David repeated, the name sticking in his throat. There's more, Elliot continued. Jessica had a challenging few years after you left. I dug into her background. She dropped out of her residency shortly after your transfer. Turns out she was pregnant at the time. David's grip tightened on the phone. Pregnant? Yes. Sophie's birth records list no father. After Sophie was born, Jessica struggled to balance being a single mother and finding stable work. She eventually met Max's biological father. They were together briefly, but he left her before Max was born. David's chest tightened. She raised them alone? For the most part, yes. She works hard, but it looks like she's just making ends meet. No recent relationships, no legal ties to anyone but her kids. David sat in stunned silence. The pieces were falling into place, but with every answer came more questions. If Sophie was his daughter, why hadn't Jessica reached out? Why had she kept her pregnancy a secret? Elliot's voice broke the silence. What do you want to do next? I can dig deeper if you need. David hesitated. Part of him wanted to rush to Jessica's door, demand answers, and meet Sophie properly. But another part of him feared what he might find. He thanked Elliot and ended the call, feeling both closer to the truth and more uncertain than ever. That weekend, he drove to the neighborhood Elliot had described, parking a block away from Jessica's modest townhouse. He didn't approach the house, just watched from his car as Sophie and Max played in the front yard. Jessica came out to call them inside, her laugh carrying through the air as she scooped Max into her arms. David's chest ached as he watched the scene. Sophie's laughter reminded him of his own as a child, and Max's tiny voice tugged at something deep within him. As Jessica led the children inside, David leaned back in his seat, gripping the steering wheel. I need answers, he whispered to himself. He didn't know how to face Jessica, but he couldn't ignore what was now painfully clear. Sophie was his daughter, and he had missed 6 years of her life. David sat outside Jessica's townhouse for over an hour, rehearsing every possible scenario in his mind. Would she welcome him? Would she be furious or worse, indifferent? The image of Sophie's face, so much like his own, gave him the push he needed. He couldn't ignore this any longer. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door. His knuckles rapped twice against the wood before he realized his hands were trembling. The door opened a moment later, and there she was, Jessica Lane. Her expression shifted from surprise to guarded recognition. David? She said cautiously. Hi, Jessica, he began, his voice uneven. I need to talk to you. It's important. Jessica hesitated, glancing back into the house where the sound of cartoons and children's laughter filled the air. She stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. What are you doing here? She asked, her arms crossed protectively. David swallowed hard, searching her face for any sign of warmth. I saw you at the park last week, he said, and I couldn't shake the feeling. That little girl, Sophie, is she mine? Jessica's eyes widened, her breath catching for just a second before she looked away. David, this isn't the time. Please, Jessica, I deserve to know. His voice cracked with desperation. I had no idea. Not about her, not about you being pregnant. If she's my daughter, she is, Jessica interrupted softly. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Relief, anger, and guilt washed over him all at once. Why didn't you tell me? Jessica's gaze hardened. I tried, David. After you had transferred, I called the hospital dozens of times. I sent letters. None of them reached you. I even went there once, but security wouldn't let me pass the front desk. They said you didn't want to be disturbed. David's stomach turned. That's not true. I never got any of that. Does it matter now? She snapped, her voice rising. By the time Sophie was born, I'd stopped trying. I had to accept that you were gone. David's head spun as her words sank in. I didn't leave by choice, he said. The transfer was sudden, and I didn't realize. I thought we'd lost touch, but I never imagined this. Jessica's shoulders slumped, her anger giving way to exhaustion. David, my life didn't stop because you left. I had Sophie to think about. And then, later, Max came along. His father. Well, he didn't stick around. David hesitated. Max isn't mine? No, she said firmly. Max's father and I were together for a short time. When he found out I was pregnant, he walked away. It's just been me and the kids since then. Her words cut deeper than he expected. A part of him had hoped, irrationally, that Max was his too. That he could step into a ready-made family and make amends for lost time. I'm sorry, Jessica, he said finally, for everything, for not being there. I would have if I'd known. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Sophie doesn't know about you, she said. As far as she's concerned, she's always just had me and Max. David felt his chest tighten. I want to be in her life, he said. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'll do whatever it takes. I want to know her. Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair. I need time to think about this, David. Sophie's my first priority, and I won't let anything disrupt her life. You've been gone for 6 years. This isn't something we can rush into. I understand, he said, though the thought of waiting tore at him. Jessica opened the door a crack, the sounds of Sophie and Max drifting out into the evening air. Good night, David. Good night, Jessica, he said, stepping back as she closed the door. David stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door before heading back to his car. His chest ached with regret, but beneath it was a flicker of hope. He had a daughter, and he wasn't going to let her slip away again. David couldn't let Jessica's accusations rest. The idea that she had tried to reach him, only to be shut out by his hospital administration, gnawed at him. That night, he sifted through his memories, replaying every detail of his transfer. It had been abrupt, too convenient, and now the circumstances felt far more suspicious than he'd realized. The next morning, he made a call to an old colleague, Dr. Miriam Clark, someone he trusted implicitly. Miriam, I need a favor, David said, his voice heavy with urgency. Anything, Miriam replied. I need to know about my transfer to St. Luke's 6 years ago. Specifically, if there was any interference or manipulation behind the scenes. Miriam was silent for a moment. That was sudden, wasn't it? And right after. She paused, hesitating. Right after Jessica and I were getting close, David finished. Okay, she said. I'll look into it. For the next 2 days, David's life was a whirlwind of surgeries and quiet dread. He barely slept, waiting for Miriam's findings. When she finally called, her tone was grim. David, there's no easy way to say this. I found out why your transfer happened the way it did. He leaned against his desk, bracing himself. Go on. It was orchestrated. Your ex-fiancée, Claudia, was involved. She had connections with the hospital board and influenced your transfer. It seems she found out about Jessica and didn't like the idea of you starting a new relationship. David's jaw tightened. Claudia and I were already over by then. Why would she care? She still had sway with the board. From what I gathered, she painted Jessica as a distraction, someone who would harm your career. She convinced them to cut ties quickly, and they pulled strings to transfer you without much notice. As for Jessica's calls and letters, Miriam hesitated. What? David demanded. They were intercepted. Someone in the administration blocked them before they could reach you. I'm sorry, David. David's hands curled into fists. So, Jessica was shut out because of Claudia's jealousy? And the administration played along? It seems that way, Miriam said quietly. I know this doesn't fix anything, but I thought you should know. Thank you, Miriam, David said before hanging up. For a while, he just sat there, his mind racing. The betrayal felt personal, not just to him, but to Jessica and Sophie as well. Years of their lives had been stolen because someone decided his career was more important than his happiness, or theirs. David confronted Claudia the next day, tracking her down at a gala event. The room was filled with glittering chandeliers and polite chatter, but David cut through the crowd like a storm. "Claudia," he said sharply, catching her attention. She turned, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "David, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He wasted no time. "Did you orchestrate my transfer to St. Luke's 6 years ago?" Her carefully curated demeanor faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Why would you ask something like that?" "Because I know you did," he said, his voice low but laced with anger. "And I know you interfered with Jessica's attempts to reach me." Claudia's face hardened. "I did what I thought was best for you. That woman was a distraction. You were on track for something great, and I wasn't going to let you throw it all away for some." Fling. David's hands tightened at his sides. Jessica wasn't a fling. She is important. You had no right. "I had every right," Claudia snapped. "You don't realize how much I protected you. If you'd stayed, you would have gotten stuck in some meaningless relationship and derailed your career." David's voice rose, drawing stares from nearby guests. "You didn't protect me. You destroyed something I didn't even get a chance to build. Do you have any idea what you've done to her, to Sophie?" Claudia's expression wavered for the first time. "Sophie? She's my daughter," David said, his voice breaking. "And I didn't even know she existed because of you." Claudia stepped back, her face pale. I didn't know?" "You didn't care," David said coldly. "Stay out of my life, Claudia. I won't let you hurt them any more than you already have." He walked away, leaving her speechless in the middle of the room. That night, David sat alone in his apartment, staring at the folder Elliot had given him. His anger had burned out, leaving only a deep, aching guilt. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to repair the damage. Jessica and Sophie had suffered because of decisions he hadn't made, but still bore responsibility for. He had to find a way to make things right. David pulled up to Jessica's modest townhouse, determination etched on his face. He had spent the last week piecing together everything he had learned: the interference from the hospital, the betrayal by Claudia, and the years Jessica had endured raising Sophie alone. He wasn't sure how to undo the damage, but he knew he had to try. He knocked, his heart pounding. Jessica opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "David, can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady. Jessica hesitated before nodding, stepping aside to let him in. The living room was warm and inviting, filled with signs of a busy family life. Toys were scattered near the couch, and a colorful drawing hung on the fridge in the adjacent kitchen. "Let me check on the kids," Jessica said, disappearing briefly into the hallway. She returned moments later, her arms crossed. "They're napping. What's this about?" David took a deep breath. "I owe you an explanation and an apology." Jessica arched an eyebrow, but her posture softened slightly. "I know about the transfer," he said. "I found out it wasn't just a coincidence. Claudia, my ex-fiancée, was involved. She manipulated the hospital into moving me and made sure your attempts to contact me were blocked." Jessica's eyes widened and her jaw tightened. "Claudia?" David nodded. "I had no idea at the time. I only just found out, and I can't tell you how sorry I am. You tried to reach me, and I wasn't there. That's on me." Jessica looked away, her voice quieter now. "I thought you didn't care, that you'd moved on." "I never stopped caring," David said. "I didn't know about Sophie. If I had..." His voice cracked, and he paused to collect himself. I missed 6 years of her life, Jessica. I want to be part of it now, if you'll let me." Jessica stared at him for a long moment, her emotions flickering across her face. Finally, she sighed. "You have every right to be in Sophie's life, but this isn't going to be easy. She doesn't know who you are. To her, it's just been me and Max." David nodded. "I understand. I'll take it slow, whenever you need. I just want to do right by her. And by you." Jessica's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You mean that?" "I do," he said firmly. "I want to be here for Sophie. And I know Max isn't my son, but if there's anything I can do to help, I will. I don't want to just show up and disrupt everything you've built a life here. I want to support it." Jessica looked down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That means a lot, David. It really does." Over the next few weeks, David began visiting regularly. At first, he came by under the guise of helping Jessica with errands and household tasks. He would read Sophie stories while Jessica cooked dinner or help Max stack blocks. Sophie quickly warmed up to him, her natural curiosity leading to endless questions about his life and work. "You're a doctor? Like Mommy used to be?" Sophie asked one evening, her eyes wide. David glanced at Jessica, who gave a small nod. "That's right," he said. "I help people when they're sick." Sophie beamed. "That's so cool. I want to be a doctor too." David's heart swelled. "You'd make a great doctor, Sophie." His bond with Max also grew unexpectedly. The little boy followed him around during visits, holding his hand and babbling excitedly. Though Max wasn't his biological son, David found himself caring for the boy deeply. "You don't have to do all this," Jessica said one evening as David helped Max build a tower of blocks. "I want to," David said simply. "Max might not be mine, but he's part of this family. And if I'm going to be here for Sophie, I want to be here for him too." Jessica studied him, her eyes softening. "You've changed, David." "So have you," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Jessica and David sat on the couch, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. "I've been thinking," David said. "I don't want to stop at just being here for Sophie. I want to help you too." Jessica frowned slightly. "Help me how?" "I found out what happened at the hospital, and I'm not letting them get away with it. They sabotaged your career, Jessica. They owe you, and I'm going to make sure you get the chance to finish what you started." Jessica blinked, stunned. "David, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "You deserve better, and so do Sophie and Max." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you, David, for everything." David smiled softly. "We'll make this right. Together." David wasted no time in taking action. Fueled by guilt and a desire to help Jessica reclaim the dreams that had been stolen from her, he began investigating the hospital administration that had orchestrated their separation. What he uncovered was even more damning than he expected evidence of unethical practices, cover-ups, and blatant misuse of power. He took the evidence to a trusted lawyer who quickly set the wheels of justice in motion. A legal case was opened, exposing not only the tampering with Jessica's career, but also similar actions taken against other employees. Meanwhile, David continued to grow closer to Sophie and Max. The children adored him, and he found himself thriving in their company. "Mommy said you're helping people fight bad guys," Sophie said one evening while drawing a picture of her family, now including David. "Something like that," David replied, smiling. "Are you a superhero too?" Sophie asked, her eyes sparkling. David chuckled. "No capes for me, but I try to help where I can." Jessica, listening from the kitchen, felt a surge of gratitude. She had been wary of letting David back into her life, but his sincerity and persistence were undeniable. Months passed, and the legal case against the hospital concluded with a settlement in Jessica's favor. She was awarded financial compensation and given an offer to resume her medical training under better conditions. "I don't know if I should take it," Jessica confessed to David one night, looking at the official letter. "Why not?" David asked, genuinely puzzled. "I've been out of the game for years," she said. "What if I've forgotten everything? And with the kids?" "You haven't forgotten," David said gently. "And I'll help with Sophie and Max. You're still that brilliant, driven person I knew years ago. You can do this, Jessica." Her gaze softened. "You really believe in me?" "Always have," he said without hesitation. Jessica took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. "Okay, I'll do it." With her newfound financial stability, Jessica decided to pursue a dream she'd long since set aside. She used part of her settlement to open a free clinic for underserved families in the community. It became a place of hope for people in need, staffed by dedicated volunteers and medical professionals. David often volunteered at the clinic during his free time, helping Jessica establish its operations. Watching her interact with patients and lead her team filled him with pride. One day, while they were locking up the clinic, Jessica turned to him. "This wouldn't have been possible without you, David." He shook his head. "This was all you. I just helped clear the path." She smiled, a rare moment of vulnerability slipping through. "It's more than that. You've been here for me, for Sophie, for Max. I don't know how to thank you." David looked at her, his voice steady. "You don't have to. I'm exactly where I want to be." At home, Sophie and Max thrived under the new routine. David's bond with the children deepened, particularly with Max, who had become fascinated by David's stories of life as a surgeon. "Can I be a doctor when I grow up?" Max asked one night as David tucked him into bed. "You can be anything you want," David said, ruffling his hair. "Will you teach me?" David smiled. "Of course. I'll teach you everything I know." Max beamed, and David felt his heart swell with affection. The months of collaboration and shared responsibility forged a new sense of unity between David and Jessica. Their co-parenting partnership evolved into something stronger: mutual respect, trust, and a rekindled connection they hadn't experienced since their brief time together years ago. Jessica found herself looking at David differently, seeing not just the man she had once cared for, but someone who had grown, who was willing to fight for her and her children. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about building something better, together. The warm afternoon sun bathed the park in golden light as David carried a picnic basket across the grassy field. Sophie ran ahead, her laughter echoing as she chased Max, who tottered along with a toy airplane. Jessica walked beside David, a soft smile on her face as she watched her children play. "Hard to believe this is the same park where all started," David said, glancing at Jessica. She chuckled. "You mean where you stalked us from a bench?" David laughed, his tone light. "I was processing." Jessica shook her head, her expression warm. "You've come a long way since then, David." They reached a shady spot under a large oak tree and began setting up the picnic. David unfolded a blanket while Jessica unpacked sandwiches, snacks, and drinks. Sophie and Max ran over, breathless and giggling, and immediately began rummaging through the food. "Max, slow down!" Jessica laughed as he grabbed a cookie. "Mommy said it's okay to eat cookies first." Max protested with a cheeky grin. David raised an eyebrow. "Did she now?" Jessica shrugged, her eyes twinkling. "Selective hearing. He gets it from you." The afternoon unfolded in easy laughter and conversation. David marveled at how natural it all felt. How far they had come from that first awkward conversation on Jessica's doorstep. Sophie tugged on David's sleeve. "Guess what, Daddy?" David's heart skipped at the word. Sophie had started calling him Daddy a month ago, and it still felt surreal. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I got the lead in the school play," she announced, her face glowing with excitement. "That's amazing, Sophie," David said, pulling her into a hug. Jessica smiled as she watched them. Sophie had adjusted seamlessly to having David in her life, and his bond with Max had become just as strong. Later, as the kids played on the nearby playground, Jessica and David sat on the blanket, sharing the quiet moment. "I can't thank you enough for everything," Jessica said softly. "You don't need to thank me," David replied. "This is where I'm meant to be." Jessica hesitated before speaking again. "You know, when I found out I was pregnant with Sophie, I felt so lost. I didn't think I could do it alone. But now, looking at her, at Max, at all of this, I feel like I found what I was meant to have." David reached over, taking her hand. "You're not alone anymore. Whatever comes next, we're in this together." Jessica's eyes met his, a flicker of something more, something deeper passing between them. She smiled, her voice steady. "We'll take it one day at a time." David nodded. One day at a time. The picnic ended with Sophie and Max performing a show they had invented on the spot, with Sophie as the star and Max enthusiastically playing every other role. Jessica and David clapped and cheered, their laughter mingling with the children's. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the four of them packed up and walked back to the car. Max dozed off in David's arms, and Sophie chattered about her play, her voice slowing as sleepiness overtook her. Jessica glanced at David as he gently placed Max into his car seat. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" he asked. "Being here. Being their dad." David's gaze softened. "It's easy when they're so incredible. They get it from their mom." Jessica blushed slightly but said nothing. That evening, as Jessica tucked the children into bed, David lingered in the living room. When she returned, she found him staring at a framed picture Sophie had drawn. It was a colorful depiction of their family, with stick figures labeled Mommy, Sophie, Max, and Daddy. She insisted on framing it, Jessica said, her voice light. David smiled. "It's perfect." Jessica hesitated before stepping closer. "You've made a difference, David. Not just for the kids, but for me too. I didn't think I could trust you again, but I do." David turned to her, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Jessica. Not ever." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I know." For the first time in years, Jessica felt the weight of her struggles lift. Together, they were building something new, something stronger. As David left that night, he glanced back at the townhouse, now illuminated with warmth and life. It wasn't just Jessica's home anymore. It was theirs, their family, their future. And for David, it felt like everything he had lost was finally found.